The first thing my parents said when they stood on my front porch after 25 years was, "Please, we have nowhere else to go." My father's voice barely sounded like the man I remembered. My mother wouldn't even look me in the eyes. Behind them sat two faded suitcases, a rusted pickup truck with a cracked windshield, and everything they still owned. Across the street, my neighbor quietly stopped watering her flowers. She wasn't staring because she knew who they were. She was staring because she had never seen anyone come to my house uninvited. I unlocked my front door but didn't move aside. "You've got the wrong address," I said calmly. My mother finally raised her head. Tears filled her eyes before she whispered, "Hannah, please." At that exact moment, a dark government SUV rolled slowly to the curb. A young captain stepped out wearing an army uniform, came to attention the moment he saw me, and said, "Good evening, Colonel Carter. Headquarters needs your signature first thing tomorrow morning." Neither of my parents spoke another word. They simply stared at me as though they had never seen me before. If you've ever felt forgotten by the people who were supposed to love you most, I hope you'll stay with me until the end of this story. And if this story truly resonates with you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell me your city or country, and what time it is there right now. My name is Hannah Carter. I'm 37 years old, and that evening changed the way I understood the word family forever. People often believe the hardest part of being abandoned is the day someone leaves. They're wrong. The hardest part is living long enough to wonder if they ever looked back. I had spent years convincing myself that question no longer mattered. Then they appeared on my doorstep carrying nothing but regret. The Colorado air was already cooling as the sun disappeared behind the Front Range. My porch light cast long shadows across the concrete, making my parents look older than their years. My father shifted his weight from one foot to the other, rubbing his hands together the same nervous way he used to before difficult conversations. I hadn't seen that habit since I was 12. "We didn't know where else to go," he finally said. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. I studied his face without answering. Time changes wrinkles. It changes hair. But guilt has a way of making someone recognizable no matter how many years have passed. My mother reached for my arm, then stopped herself before touching me. "Can we just talk?" she asked quietly. I looked beyond them toward the empty street. Colorado Springs was unusually peaceful that evening. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Wind stirred the American flag hanging from my front porch. Everything felt strangely ordinary, which somehow made the moment even heavier. I had imagined meeting them again hundreds of times over the years. In every version, I thought I would be angry. Instead, I felt tired. There comes a point when pain becomes so old that it no longer burns. It simply settles into the quiet places inside you. My neighbor eventually walked back into her house, but not before giving me a concerned glance. To everyone else, my parents looked like two elderly people asking their daughter for help. They couldn't possibly know that 25 years earlier, these same two people had driven away and never came back. They couldn't know that I had built an entirely different life from the one they left behind. And they certainly couldn't know that the biggest secret wasn't my military career. It was something buried inside a forgotten file that none of us had seen since the day I disappeared from their lives. I didn't know it yet, but before that week was over, one impossible truth would force every member of my family to question everything they believed about the day they abandoned me. I stood there for a long moment before stepping aside. "You can come in for a few minutes," I said quietly. "But tonight is not the night we rewrite 25 years. My father lowered his head. "We understand." I was not sure he really did. They walked into my house as though they were entering a place that belonged to someone else, because they were. The living room was simple. A bookshelf filled one wall. Family photographs did not. The only framed picture on the fireplace showed a group of soldiers standing beneath a wide Colorado sky, smiling despite the dust on their uniforms. My mother studied it for a second. "Is that your unit?" she asked. "People I trust," I answered. She nodded but said nothing else. Sometimes silence carries more weight than words ever could. I made coffee out of habit, even though it was nearly 9 at night. My aunt used to say that difficult conversations were easier when everyone had something warm in their hands. I still believed she was right. Aunt Margaret was never supposed to become my family. She simply opened her front door one summer afternoon in Knoxville, Tennessee, and found a frightened 12-year-old girl sitting on her porch with a backpack that held 2 shirts, 1 pair of jeans, a worn paperback novel, and a stuffed rabbit I was already too old to admit I still slept with. "Sweetheart," she had asked softly, kneeling beside me, "where are your parents?" I smiled because I believed they would be back before dinner. "They just had to take care of something," I told her. "They said they would come back soon." She looked toward the empty road behind me before gently placing her hand on my shoulder. "Why don't you come inside while we wait?" We waited until the porch light came on, then until the crickets filled the yard, then until midnight. They never came back. Children measure time differently than adults. 1 hour feels endless. 1 promise feels permanent. For weeks, I folded the same little note my mother had left inside my backpack until the paper became soft around the edges. It only said, "Be good. We love you." At 12 years old, I believed those words. It took me much longer to understand that love without presence can become one of the loneliest things a child ever learns. Aunt Margaret never spoke badly about them. Not once. Every birthday, she baked me a cake from scratch. Every Christmas, she wrapped one gift as if it were the most important present in America. She worked long hours as a librarian, yet somehow always found time to ask about my homework. "You matter, Hannah," she would remind me whenever I doubted myself. "Do not let somebody else's decision become your identity." Those words stayed with me long after I left Tennessee. They followed me through college, through military training, through every lonely apartment and every deployment. The Army taught me discipline. Aunt Margaret taught me dignity. Across my kitchen table, my father quietly wrapped both hands around the coffee mug I had placed in front of him. "We heard you did well for yourself," he said carefully. I looked at him for a moment before answering. "You heard that?" He nodded once. "Not from us," my mother whispered. We did not know where you were." I almost smiled, but it never reached my face. That was the strange part. They spoke as though losing me had simply happened to them, like a storm or an accident. They still did not understand that being left behind had not been the first time I learned what it felt like to be unwanted. In many ways, that lesson had started years before they ever drove away from Aunt Margaret's house. My father stared into his coffee for so long that the steam disappeared before he took a single sip. "We made mistakes," he finally said. "More than mistakes," I answered quietly. "Mistakes happen once." This lasted for years. He looked down again, and the room became still except for the soft ticking of the old clock hanging above my kitchen doorway. Strange how ordinary sounds become louder when nobody knows what to say. The truth was, being left on Aunt Margaret's porch had not broken me by itself. It had simply confirmed something I had been learning long before that afternoon. I had never been the child my parents reached for first. Growing up in Lexington, Kentucky, I learned that favoritism rarely announces itself. It arrives in small moments. Jacob received a new bicycle for his birthday. Mine came from a yard sale with chipped paint and one loose pedal. Emily wanted piano lessons, so my parents rearranged the family budget without hesitation. When I asked to join the school science camp, my father smiled without looking up from the newspaper. "Maybe next year, Hannah." Next year never came. At first, I believed money was simply tight. Children are generous with excuses for the people they love. Then one Saturday afternoon, I overheard my parents talking in the garage. "Jacob has real potential," my father said. "We need to invest where it matters." My mother answered so quietly I almost missed it. "What about Hannah?" There was a long pause before he sighed. "She will figure things out. She always does." Those words stayed with me far longer than they probably stayed with him. There is something lonely about being the dependable child. People begin expecting your strength until they forget you ever needed comfort. I stopped asking for things after that. I packed my own lunches. I finished my homework without reminders. I learned how to sew loose buttons back onto my school clothes because I did not want to interrupt anyone's evening. One winter morning, my teacher handed me a certificate for finishing first in the county essay competition. "Your parents will be proud," she said with a smile. I believed her. I carried that certificate home so carefully that I refused to fold it, even though the wind kept trying to pull it from my hands. My father glanced at it for less than 5 seconds. "That is nice," he said. Then he turned toward Jacob. "How did baseball practice go?" I stood there holding the paper until my arms grew tired. My mother noticed. but she only offered a small smile before clearing the dinner plates. Looking back now, I think she wanted to protect the peace more than she wanted to protect me. Those are not always the same thing. The older Jacob became, the more confident he sounded whenever he spoke to me. "Dad trusts me with important things," he would say with a grin. "You worry too much." Emily copied whatever she saw. "Why are you always so serious?" she asked, once while I washed dishes after dinner. "Smile more. Dad says people like happy girls." I smiled because arguing never changed anything. Some families raise children together. Ours quietly taught each of us different rules. Jacob learned he would be forgiven. Emily learned she would be protected. I learned that silence caused the fewest problems. Years later, people would tell me I was incredibly calm under pressure. They thought the army had taught me that. They were only partly right. I had been practicing since childhood. Across my kitchen table, my mother finally whispered, "We did not realize how much you remembered." I met her eyes for the first time that evening. "You remember different things when you are the one nobody notices." My father slowly set his untouched coffee on the table, his hands trembling just enough for the porcelain to rattle. Then he looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not guilt alone, it was fear, because for the first time, he seemed to understand that I had not even begun telling the story of what happened before they abandoned me. My father kept turning the coffee mug in slow circles as though the answer might be hiding inside it. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Hannah," he said, "we did not come here only to apologize." I looked at him without speaking. There are moments when you already know the next sentence will hurt before it is ever spoken. This was one of them. My mother reached into her worn handbag and carefully pulled out a thick manila envelope. She slid it across the kitchen table toward me. "What is this?" I asked. Neither of them answered immediately. My father finally whispered, "The bank is taking everything. There are medical bills, credit cards, loans." He swallowed hard before continuing. "We need your help." I rested my hand on the envelope but did not open it. "Help comes in many forms," I said. "Which kind are you asking for?" He looked embarrassed for only a second. Then years of old habits quietly returned to his voice. "You have a good career. You own this house," we figured. "Maybe you could refinance it, or sell it if necessary." I thought I had misunderstood him. "You want me to sell my home?" "Only until we get back on our feet," my mother added quickly. "It would be temporary." I stared at both of them. 25 years had passed, yet somehow they still believed my life existed to solve their problems. The strangest part was not the request itself. It was how naturally they made it, as though they were asking me to pass the salt across the dinner table. My father leaned forward. "You have always been responsible. We know you can fix this." Responsible. That word again. It had followed me my entire life. Responsible enough to accept less. Responsible enough to understand disappointment. Responsible enough to clean up after everyone else's decisions. I slowly pushed the envelope back across the table. "I have not even looked inside." "You do not need to," he replied. "We are family." I almost smiled. Family. I repeated the word quietly, letting it settle between us. "That is an interesting choice." My mother lowered her eyes. "Please do not punish us forever." "I am not punishing you," I answered. "I am trying to understand why you believe you still have the right to ask this of me." Neither of them answered. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the front windows before disappearing down the street. My dog, Ranger, lifted his head from the rug beside the fireplace, but remained perfectly still. Animals often sense tension before people admit it exists. My father finally opened the envelope himself. Mortgage statements, collection notices, legal letters. One by one, he spread them across my table until the wood almost disappeared beneath the paperwork. "Jacob promised he was investing the money," he said quietly. "Emily told us everything would work out." His voice broke. "Instead, they took everything." I looked down at the papers without touching them. I felt sympathy. I truly did. Losing everything at their age was heartbreaking. But sympathy is not the same thing as trust. "Why now?" I asked softly. "Why did you not come 5 years ago? Or 10? My mother answered before my father could speak. "Because we thought Jacob would make things right." The room became silent again. That single sentence explained more than she realized. Even after all these years, they had come to me only after every other door had closed. I stood, gathered the papers into one neat stack, and handed the envelope back to my father. "You can stay in the guest room tonight," I said. "Tomorrow we will decide what happens next." Relief washed across both their faces. They thought they had won something. They did not notice that I had never once said I would help pay their debts. As I turned off the kitchen light and walked toward the hallway, my phone vibrated with a message from Aunt Margaret. It contained only 8 words. "Do not sign anything until you read your mailbox." My heartbeat slowed instead of quickening, because Aunt Margaret never sent messages like that unless she already knew something I did not. I barely slept that night. Not because my parents were under my roof, but because Aunt Margaret had never been careless with her words. If she told me not to sign anything until I checked my mailbox, there was a reason. Before sunrise, I stepped onto my front porch with a cup of black coffee in one hand. The Colorado air carried the crisp chill that always reminded me how quiet mornings could be before the world started making demands. My mailbox stood at the end of the driveway, exactly where it always had. Inside was a thick overnight envelope with Aunt Margaret's familiar handwriting. I slipped it under my arm without opening it. Some truths deserve a table instead of a sidewalk. When I walked back inside, my parents were already awake. My mother had found the frying pan and was making scrambled eggs, as though she had lived there for years. My father sat at the kitchen island, reading yesterday's newspaper. For one strange moment, it almost looked like an ordinary family breakfast. Then my father smiled. "I told your mother things would work out." I placed the unopened envelope on the counter. "Nothing has worked out yet." He waved his hand dismissively. "You gave us a place to stay. We knew you would not turn your back on us." His confidence surprised me more than his request the night before. Somewhere along the way, he had mistaken my kindness for surrender. My mother placed a plate in front of me. "Eat something, sweetheart." I looked at the eggs for a second before quietly moving the plate aside. "I have a meeting at Fort Carson in an hour." "That is fine," my father replied. "Your mother and I can start calling contractors today." I frowned. "Contractors?" "To get the guest room ready." He spoke as though discussing weekend plans. "We will probably need to stay here for several months." I stared at him. "Who decided that?" He looked genuinely confused. "Well, family takes care of family." There was that word again. Family. The same word that had disappeared from their vocabulary for 25 years had suddenly become their strongest argument. Before I could answer, the front doorbell rang. Standing outside was my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, holding a fresh loaf of banana bread. "I heard your parents arrived," she said warmly. "It is wonderful that everyone is together again." My father smiled proudly before I had the chance to speak. "Our daughter insisted we stay with her." I turned toward him slowly. I had said nothing of the sort. Mrs. Henderson beamed. "That is exactly what good children do." After she left, my father chuckled. "See? People understand." I remained silent, but something inside me shifted. They were no longer simply asking for help. They were quietly building a story where I had already agreed to everything. By lunchtime, the pressure became heavier. My phone rang 3 times. Distant relatives I had not spoken to in years somehow already knew my parents were staying with me. "Your mother says you have a beautiful home," one cousin said cheerfully. "It is nice that you are finally taking care of them," another added. "Your father has always been proud of you, even if he did not always know how to show it." I listened without arguing. Correcting people who only know half the story rarely changes their minds. It only exhausts yours. That afternoon, I finally opened Aunt Margaret's envelope in my home office with the door locked. Inside were copies of legal records, old letters, and one sealed envelope with my name written across the front in handwriting I recognized instantly but had not seen in 25 years. Before I could break the seal, my father knocked firmly on the office door. "Hannah," he called. "There is someone downstairs asking about refinancing your house." I told him you would sign whatever paperwork was necessary. My hand froze over the unopened letter. In that instant, I realized they had already begun making promises using a life that had never belonged to them. My father was waiting in the living room by the time I walked downstairs. He had already invited the loan officer inside. The man stood awkwardly beside the fireplace, leather briefcase in one hand, clearly believing he had arrived for an appointment. "Colonel Carter?" he asked politely. I am David Collins from Mountain West Lending. Your father said you wanted to discuss refinancing your property. I looked at him for a moment before answering. Mr. Collins, I think someone misunderstood the situation. Before I could say anything else, my father stepped between us. She is just overwhelmed. We talked about this all morning. I turned slowly toward him. No, I said evenly. You talked. I listened. The loan officer glanced from one face to the other, sensing he had walked into a conversation that had started decades before he ever knocked on my door. Perhaps I should come back another day, he offered. That would be best, I replied. He nodded, apologized quietly, and left without another question. The front door closed, and with it disappeared the last polite witness. My father's expression changed almost immediately. Why would you embarrass us like that? He demanded. His voice was louder now, more familiar. It reminded me of the man I had known before I turned 12. Embarrass you? I asked. You invited a stranger into my home to discuss selling something that belongs to me. We are trying to survive, he answered. And I am trying to understand why you believe my answer was already yours to give. My mother stepped forward, wringing her hands together. Please stop arguing. We cannot lose this chance. I looked at her with more sadness than anger. Did you ever wonder whether I felt that way 25 years ago? She opened her mouth, but no words came. Silence has a way of exposing truths that conversation often hides. By evening, the pressure had found another path. My phone rang again. This time it was Jacob. I had not heard his voice in years. So, he said casually, Mom and Dad finally found you. I did not answer immediately. You sound surprised, I said. He laughed softly. Do not make this difficult. They told me you have a nice house now. You always land on your feet. What do you want, Jacob? Just do the right thing. They took care of you when you were little. I closed my eyes for a second. Some lies become so comfortable that people stop recognizing them as lies. Is that what they told you? I asked. It is what happened. No, I answered quietly. It is what you chose to believe. He hung up without another word. I placed my phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood there listening to the refrigerator hum. It is remarkable how lonely a house can feel, even when every room is occupied. That evening, my parents began talking about rearranging furniture in the guest room. My father measured the closet with a tape measure he had found in my garage. My mother asked whether the nearby church offered senior activities because, in her words, we may be here for quite a while. Neither of them asked whether I wanted them to stay. Decisions were quietly being made around me, as though my silence had become permission. Years ago, that version of me would have apologized simply to keep the peace. The army taught me many things, but one lesson mattered more than all the others. A calm voice is not the same as surrender. After they went to bed, I carried Aunt Margaret's unopened letter into my office and locked the door behind me. The envelope rested in my hands, its edges worn with age. My name written in handwriting that belonged to another lifetime. I knew that once I broke the seal, there would be no returning to the story I had believed for 25 years. I took one slow breath, reached for the letter opener on my desk, and made a quiet decision. Tomorrow, I would stop defending the life I had built. Tomorrow, I would finally begin searching for the truth. The letter was older than I expected. The paper had turned the soft shade of ivory that only comes with time, and the edges were worn as though it had been handled more than once before Aunt Margaret sealed it inside the larger envelope. I unfolded it carefully, almost afraid that one careless movement might erase whatever truth had survived all these years. The handwriting stopped me before I read the first sentence. It belonged to my mother. There was no doubt about that. I had seen those looping letters on birthday cards when I was little, back when birthdays still meant something. I read the first line once, then again. Then I folded the letter closed without reading any further. Not because I was afraid, because I suddenly understood something Aunt Margaret had tried to tell me without saying it directly. Some truths should never be discovered while emotions are louder than judgment. I slipped the letter back into its envelope and locked it inside my desk drawer. If I was going to learn what really happened, I wanted facts before feelings. The next morning I drove to Fort Carson before sunrise. The familiar sight of soldiers jogging across the parade field brought a strange kind of peace. Out there, rank did not erase responsibility. Every decision left a record. Every order could be traced. Life would have been much easier if families worked the same way. Major Olivia Brooks found me sitting alone outside headquarters with 2 untouched cups of coffee. She smiled the moment she saw me. "You only buy 2 coffees when something serious is happening." I handed her one without answering. She waited. Good friends understand that silence is sometimes part of the conversation. After several minutes, I finally spoke. "Have you ever discovered your life was built on a story that might not be true?" Olivia looked toward the mountains before answering. "More than once." She took a slow sip. "The question is whether you want comfort or the truth." "The truth," I said, "even if it hurts." She nodded once. "Then start with documents. Memories fade. Paper usually does not." Those words stayed with me long after we finished our coffee. That afternoon, instead of returning directly home, I drove to the county records office in Lexington, Kentucky, through its online public archive. I requested copies of every document connected to my guardianship, school enrollment, and family records from the year I turned 12. The clerk on the phone sounded kind. "Some of those files are archived," she explained. "It may take a day or two." "That is fine," I replied. "I have already waited 25 years. When I returned home, my parents were sitting comfortably in my living room, watching television, as though they had always belonged there. My father muted the volume. "Did you think about the refinancing?" he asked. "I thought about many things today," I answered. "Good," he said with visible relief. "I knew you would come around." I simply walked past him. For the first time, I realized something important. He no longer frightened me. He no longer controlled the direction of the conversation inside my own mind. That evening, I quietly photographed every financial document they had left on my kitchen table and placed digital copies into a secure folder. I also wrote down every conversation I could remember since they arrived, including dates, times, and exact words whenever possible. Military life teaches you that details matter long before they become evidence. I never told my parents what I was doing. They believed my silence meant agreement. In reality, it gave me room to think. Just before midnight, my telephone rang. The caller identification showed the Kentucky Records Office. "Colonel Carter," the clerk said carefully, "we found something unusual in your file." I straightened in my chair. "What kind of unusual?" There was a brief silence on the other end before she answered. "According to the original court index, one document that should have been included has been missing for more than 2 decades, but this morning, someone returned it anonymously." The clerk's words stayed with me long after the call ended. A missing document, an anonymous return. Those 2 phrases should have been simple. They were not. They carried the weight of 25 years of unanswered questions. I sat alone in my office with the lights off, looking at the sealed envelope from Aunt Margaret and the small stack of records I had collected. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Not anger, not sadness, something closer to possibility. The next morning, I made an appointment with an attorney in Colorado Springs named Samuel Reed. I chose him carefully. I did not need someone who wanted revenge. I needed someone who understood facts. When I walked into his office, he looked over the documents I had brought and listened without interrupting. That alone told me I had chosen the right person. After nearly an hour, he placed the papers on his desk and folded his hands. "Hannah, before we discuss what can be done, I need to ask you something." "What?" I asked. "What do you want from this?" I looked out the window at the busy street below. People were walking to work, carrying coffee, answering phone calls, living ordinary mornings. I wondered how many of them carried old questions they had never been brave enough to answer. "I want the truth," I said. "After that, I will decide what comes next." Samuel nodded. That is usually where justice starts. Over the next several days, we built a timeline. Not a story, not assumptions, a timeline. Every address, every date, every document, every person connected to what happened when I was 12 years old. The more we organized, the clearer one thing became. There were gaps. Too many gaps. "Someone spent a lot of effort making sure parts of your history were difficult to find," Samuel said one afternoon. I looked at him carefully. "Are you saying someone erased it?" He shook his head. "I am saying someone made it harder to see." That difference mattered. Accusations could be emotional. Evidence had to be patient. At home, my parents continued believing they were waiting for my decision about their financial problems. My father became more comfortable every day. He started giving opinions about my furniture. He suggested changes to my kitchen. He even mentioned that once things settled down, we could look into selling my current house and finding something more practical for everyone. I listened quietly. Years ago, those comments would have made me question myself. Now, I simply noticed them. That was the difference. I was no longer the 12-year-old girl waiting on a porch for someone to return. One evening, my mother found me reviewing paperwork at the dining room table. "Are you still upset with us?" she asked. I looked up. Her voice sounded smaller than before. "I am trying to understand you," I answered. She sat across from me. "We were scared back then." I waited. Scared of what? Her fingers tightened around her coffee cup. For a moment, I thought she might finally say something she had hidden for decades. Instead, she whispered, "Things were more complicated than you know." Complicated. Another word people use when the truth is still waiting. After she left the room, I opened the sealed envelope Aunt Margaret had given me. This time, I was ready. Inside was a single letter and a photocopy of an old legal form. My eyes moved across the page slowly. Then I saw the signature at the bottom. It was not my mother's. It was not my father's. But I knew the name written there. And suddenly, I understood why someone had returned that missing document after all these years. Because the person who had hidden the truth was not finished protecting themselves. The name on that document belonged to someone I had not thought about in 25 years. Someone who was never supposed to be part of the story. I stared at the signature until the letters blurred together. Then I picked up my phone and called Samuel Reed. He answered on the second ring. "Hannah?" he asked. "Did you find something?" I took a slow breath. "I think I found the person who signed the document that changed my life." There was a pause. Not a dramatic pause. The kind of silence that happens when someone realizes a conversation has moved into unfamiliar territory. "Send me a copy," he said. "Do not confront anyone yet." That last sentence told me everything. Samuel had seen enough situations like this to know that the first person who reacts emotionally is often the person who loses control of the story. The next morning, I sat across from him in his office, while he examined the document under the bright light on his desk. The room smelled like coffee and old paper. It was not the kind of place where secrets disappeared. It was the kind of place where they were carefully uncovered. "This is a guardianship transfer request," Samuel said. My stomach tightened. "Guardianship?" He nodded slowly. "From the year you turned 12. I looked down at the page. My parents told me they were leaving me with my aunt temporarily. Samuel did not answer right away. Instead, he turned the document toward me. "Hannah, according to this record, your parents did not simply leave you with your aunt." I waited. "They legally transferred temporary custody." The words landed differently than I expected. For years, I had carried the memory of a car driving away. I had carried the image of a child sitting alone, believing she had been forgotten. Now I was learning that there had been paperwork, a decision, a process, not just a disappearance. "Why would they do that?" I asked quietly. Samuel looked at the signature again. "That is the question we need answered." He pointed to the bottom of the page. "Because this signature is not from your parents." I looked closer. "Then whose is it?" He leaned back in his chair. "Someone who claimed to be acting on their behalf." My mind immediately went back through every conversation I had ever had with my parents, every excuse, every vague answer. Every time they said things were more complicated than I knew. For the first time, those words sounded different. Not like confusion, like avoidance. When I returned home that afternoon, my parents were sitting on the porch. My father looked relaxed, almost comfortable. "There you are," he said. "We were wondering when you would be back." I sat beside them, keeping my expression calm. "Did you ever tell me the complete truth about what happened when I was 12? The question changed the air immediately. My mother looked away. My father stopped moving. "Why would you ask that now?" he said. "Not denial, not surprise. A question. And sometimes the questions people ask reveal more than the answers they give." "Because I found records," I replied. My father's face lost color for just a moment. Then he recovered. Records can be misunderstood. I watched him carefully. 25 years ago, I would have accepted that answer because I wanted to believe him. But I was not that child anymore. That night, Samuel called me with an update. Hannah, I found another name connected to the file. I sat up straight. Whose name? His voice became quieter. The person who submitted the paperwork was not your aunt. I felt a cold stillness settle over me. Then who was it? There was a long pause before he answered. Someone from your own family. And Hannah. They were the one person who had the most to gain from you being gone. Samuel asked me to come to his office early the next morning. The sky over Colorado Springs was still gray when I arrived, and the streets were quiet enough that I could hear my own footsteps as I walked through the parking lot. I had spent years making decisions under pressure, but nothing prepared me for the feeling of sitting down to uncover the truth about my own childhood. Samuel placed a folder on the table between us. It was thicker than the one I had seen before. Before we go through this, he said, I want you to understand something. The documents tell a story, people tell another. Our job is to separate the two. I nodded. Show me. He opened the first page. The name appeared at the top, Jacob Carter. My older brother. For a moment, I felt nothing. Not anger, not shock, just a strange emptiness. The kind you feel when a piece of a puzzle finally fits into a place you never wanted it to belong. Samuel continued carefully. When your parents began struggling financially, Jacob convinced them he could help manage the situation. He told them he had connections. He told them he knew how to protect the family. I looked at the papers in front of me, and they believed him. Samuel nodded. They did. That was the part I struggled with most. Not because Jacob had manipulated them. That was painful, but not surprising. The hardest part was realizing my parents had been willing to trust someone else more than they trusted me. What happened after they signed? I asked. Samuel turned another page. The original agreement was temporary guardianship. Your parents intended to bring you back after resolving their financial issues. I looked up. They intended to? He nodded. But Jacob altered the situation. He filed additional paperwork claiming your parents had chosen a permanent arrangement. My hands tightened slightly. And nobody checked? Samuel sighed. People assume families tell the truth about family matters. Sometimes that assumption creates the biggest mistakes. For 25 years, I had carried one simple belief. They left because they did not want me. Now I was facing something more complicated. They had failed me in a different way. They had chosen convenience over courage. They had allowed someone else to make a decision about my life, and then they lived with the silence afterward. That was not innocence, but it was not the same story I had believed. Where was Aunt Margaret in all of this? I asked. Samuel opened another document. She was never supposed to become your guardian. She stepped in when she realized you had been left without proper support. She spent years trying to contact your parents. My eyes moved across the records. Letters. Phone calls. Returned mail. Attempts to reconnect. All marked with dates. All ignored. I felt something break inside me, but it was not the pain of abandonment. It was the grief of realizing how many people had known I was waiting and still did nothing. That evening, I returned home and found my parents sitting at the kitchen table. My father looked up. You know something, don't you? He asked. I placed the folder down gently. I know what happened. My mother covered her mouth. Hannah, no, I said softly. I need you to listen this time. For the first time in my life, they did. I told them about the documents, about Jacob, about the signatures, about the years Aunt Margaret spent trying to protect me. My father sat completely still. My mother cried quietly into her hands. We thought you were safe, she whispered. I looked at her. I was a child. I was not supposed to be the one who survived your decisions. Nobody spoke after that. Then my phone rang. It was Samuel. His voice was serious. Hannah, there is one more thing. I stepped away from the table. What is it? He paused. The documents prove Jacob deceived your family. But there is something else we found. My heart slowed. What else? The person who helped him hide the truth for 25 years just filed a request to meet with you. I looked through the kitchen doorway at my parents. For the first time since they arrived, they looked afraid. Not of me. Of what was finally coming to light. The person who asked to meet me arrived 3 days later. His name was Daniel Whitmore, the attorney who had handled some of my parents' financial paperwork years ago. He was older now, with silver hair and tired eyes, the kind of eyes that suggested someone had carried a burden for a long time. He sat across from me in Samuel's office and placed a small folder on the table. "I have spent years wondering whether this day would come," he said. I did not respond immediately. "Why did you wait?" I asked. He looked down at his hands. "Because I was afraid." That answer surprised me more than an excuse would have. Fear was something I understood, but fear did not erase responsibility. "You were an attorney," I said quietly. "You had a responsibility." He nodded. "I did." Inside the folder were copies of emails, letters, and notes from years ago. Daniel explained that after Jacob convinced my parents to sign the documents, he pressured him to process the paperwork quickly. At the time, Daniel believed he was helping a family solve a difficult situation. Later, he noticed inconsistencies, missing signatures, strange changes, questions that did not have answers. "I should have investigated further," he admitted. "I told myself it was a family matter. I told myself your parents knew what they were doing. I looked at the documents. And when you realized they did not?" He closed his eyes briefly. I stayed quiet. The honesty hurt more than a lie would have. But for the first time in years, I was hearing people stop protecting themselves with excuses. The consequences began unfolding naturally after that. Jacob was no longer the successful son everyone admired. The financial records Samuel uncovered showed years of manipulation. The investments he promised my parents were never what he claimed. The money they trusted him with had slowly disappeared through reckless decisions and hidden debts. When my father learned the full extent of it, he did not yell. He simply sat at the kitchen table in silence. "I spent my whole life believing I knew which child would protect me," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I was wrong." My mother looked at him with tears in her eyes. "We were wrong about both of you." That sentence stayed with me, because it was the first time they acknowledged something they had avoided for decades. They had not only lost money, they had lost relationships, they had lost trust, they had lost the connection with the daughter they had once treated as the easiest person to leave behind. Jacob eventually reached out to me. His message was short. "Can we talk?" I agreed, not because I owed him forgiveness, but because I no longer wanted unanswered questions controlling my life. We met in a quiet coffee shop near downtown Colorado Springs. He looked different. Not physically. The confidence was gone. "I thought I was fixing everything," he said. I listened. "I thought I deserved more responsibility than you." I looked at him carefully. "That was the problem, Jacob. You thought everything was about what you deserved." He lowered his eyes. For once he had no argument. "I was jealous," he admitted. "Everyone always talked about how strong you were." I almost smiled sadly. "You never saw how much it cost me to become that strong." He nodded slowly. There was no dramatic apology that could erase 25 years. Some damage does not disappear because someone finally admits it exists. But accountability matters. It is the beginning of change. My parents eventually moved into a smaller assisted living community outside Colorado Springs. Not because I abandoned them. Because they needed a place they could afford and a life they could manage. I helped them organize paperwork. I visited when I could. But I also kept boundaries I should have learned much earlier. One evening, my father handed me an old photograph from when I was 12 years old. "I kept this all these years," he said. I looked at the picture of a little girl who still believed every promise adults made. "I am sorry," he whispered. This time I believed he meant it. Not because the past had changed, it had not, but because the truth had finally forced all of us to stop pretending. And as I drove home that night, I realized something I had spent years trying to understand. Justice was not watching someone fall. Justice was finally being free from carrying what they had done. 6 months after everything changed, I stood in my backyard watching the first snow of the season settle over Colorado Springs. The world looked quiet in a way I had never known before. Not empty, quiet. There is a difference. For most of my life, silence meant waiting for someone to leave, waiting for bad news, waiting for another reminder that I was not chosen. But that morning, silence felt like peace. My life did not suddenly become perfect after the truth came out. Healing does not happen in one conversation or one apology. It happens slowly, in small moments that nobody else sees. It happened when I stopped checking my phone, hoping for approval from people who had spent years withholding it. It happened when I walked into my own home and realized I no longer needed permission to belong there. My father and mother settled into their new life nearby. They were not the parents I wished I had growing up. They could not give me back the birthdays, the childhood memories, or the years we lost. But they finally learned to speak honestly. My father called me one afternoon and said, "I know I cannot fix what happened. I just want you to know that I am grateful you gave me a chance to apologize." I sat quietly for a moment before answering. "I appreciate that, Dad. It was not a perfect ending. Real families rarely have those. But it was a truthful one." Jacob moved away after taking responsibility for the damage he caused. The confidence he once carried had been replaced by humility. We were not suddenly close. Some relationships need time before trust can return. But for the first time, our conversations were based on honesty instead of competition. Emily reached out as well. She admitted that she had spent years believing the version of the story everyone else told her. "I should have asked you," she said. "I should have listened. And I realized something important. Sometimes people hurt us because they are cruel. Other times they hurt us because they never had the courage to question what they were told. Understanding that did not erase the pain, but it helped me release it." I returned to Fort Carson and continued serving the people who had become my second family. The Army had given me purpose when I was a young woman searching for a place to belong. But now I understood something I had not understood before. Belonging was not something someone else had to grant me. I had already earned it. One evening, I visited Aunt Margaret in Tennessee. We sat on her porch drinking sweet tea, watching the sunset stretch across the yard where I had once waited for a car that never returned. She looked at me and smiled. "You know, Hannah, that little girl sitting on this porch all those years ago would be proud of you." I looked out at the road and thought about everything that little girl had survived. I think she would finally understand that she was never the problem. Aunt Margaret squeezed my hand. On my way home, I stopped at a quiet overlook outside Colorado Springs. The mountains stood in the distance, covered with fresh snow, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely free from the past. I kept an old photograph on my desk now. It was the picture of me at 12 years old. Not because I wanted to remember the abandonment, but because I wanted to remember the girl who kept going. If you have ever been made to feel unwanted, please remember this. Someone else's failure to see your value does not remove your value. Protect your peace. Build healthy boundaries. Choose people who choose you. Your story is not defined by who walked away. It is defined by who you become afterward. If this story touched your heart, thank you for listening. You are welcome to share your thoughts. Like this story, subscribe for more stories of resilience and hope, and share it with someone who may need to hear this message. The greatest lesson I learned was simple. Forgiveness can bring peace, but self-respect is what brings you home. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope we meet again in the next story.